Hey there, IELTS listeners. This is David Wills with another episode of TED-IELTS. Today I'm going to be talking about common grammar mistakes. The reason for this is a few days ago, I posted a video about IELTS, about how there's no trick for IELTS success. And I asked if there was anything you wanted to see in my next video. And somebody called Live Your Life suggested making a video about common mistakes for IELTS. That's a great idea. It was something I was planning to do in the future, and I thought, why not do it now? I'll put it out this weekend, and you can get immediate advantage of it. So here today, we're going to be looking at common grammar mistakes that appear in the essays written by IELTS candidates. So firstly, we need to consider why exactly this is so important. Well, grammar is a very important part of the IELTS writing exam. It is worth 25% of your grade. The four criteria, which are each worth 25%, are vocabulary, grammar, coherence and cohesion, and task response. And so grammar is an important component of your writing. You must explain your meaning precisely and accurately in your writing. And your grammar makes sure that you are understood. And bad grammar means that you will not be understood. One of the most important things I'll tell you today is something I'll tell you now, and that's don't be afraid to keep it simple. One of the biggest mistakes a student can make is trying to use overly complicated language. I see it all the time. Students write these sentences that are just so long, and understanding what they mean is impossible. And this is the worst thing you can do, to be honest. It is far better to have a simple essay that is written correctly than to have a very complicated one that is impossible to understand. When you're looking at the IELTS exam and what is required, you should be looking at the band scores. And here on the left of this screen, we can see bands 4 through 7. If we look from the bottom up, at band 4, concerning grammar, there are going to be lots and lots and lots of errors. The sentences will be predominantly simple. That's just one independent clause. The punctuation will usually be incorrect, and there are going to be a lot of fragments which are non-sentences. We'll look at that in a moment. For a band 5 score, you'll start getting more complex sentences, and the most basic sentences will generally be correct in a grammatical sense, especially the simple sentences. Moving up to a band 6, what you'll see is there's more of a natural mix of sentence types. If you look at a native speaker's writing, you'll see it will go simple, complex, complex, compound, simple, compound, complex. So there's this natural mix. It brings a lot of rhythm into our language. And of course, for a band 6, you're looking at getting pretty much no errors in your most very basic sentences. A lot of the people I speak to are aiming for a band 7, and once you get up to this level, you're only allowed 3 mistakes in grammar. That's quite difficult for task 2, 250 words. And it's a good reason why your tutors will tell you, don't write too much for this exam. If you're very confident and you're writing fast, you might be tempted to write 350 words, but actually that's not the right thing to do. You should try to stick to that 250, 270 word range, because the more you write, the more likely it is that you'll include more mistakes. So you just heard me talking about sentence types, simple and complex. There are 4 types of sentence in English. There's the simple, the compound, the complex, and the compound complex sentences. It is essential that you know these. What we're thinking about today, though, is the fact that if you don't use these 4 sentences, what you have is an incorrect sentence. If it is not simple, compound, complex, or compound complex, then it is a mistake. You can read all about these sentence types in my book, Grammar for IELTS Writing. You can get a free copy at my website. You don't need to sign up. You don't need to do anything. You just go download it. It's a Google Drive document. I actually recently updated it as I had a designer work on the layout. The content's exactly the same, but it looks a lot better on the inside now. So we have 3 related mistakes, and these are quite big mistakes, and they come from not correctly using the sentence types. These are sentence fragments, run-on sentences, and comma splices. And we'll look at all of these today. The most common error in grammar that I see in my IELTS students is the sentence fragment. And to be honest, it is also an error you sometimes see in native speakers making. This is when a sentence fails to be a sentence. When you write what seems to be a sentence, but it just doesn't work. It is completely wrong. A sentence at its most basic needs to have at least one independent clause, but a sentence fragment has none. There are no clauses at all. So a sentence fragment is when it looks like a sentence. Maybe it starts with a capital letter and it ends with a full stop. But when we look at it, it doesn't feel right. And if you know your grammar well, you'll realize it's missing something. So a sentence, an independent clause, must have 3 things at its very least. It must have a subject, a verb, and it must express a complete thought. So let's look at these 2 examples of sentence fragments. I have underlined them for you. I'd like you to pause the video now and take a few minutes, or as long as you need, to see if you can correct them. I will show you the correct answer in just a moment. So pause the video now, grab a notebook. This participation will help you, I promise. So this sentence fragment we had there, operating on the boy, the problem was there was no subject in that clause. And by bringing these 2 sentences together, you introduce the doctor as the subject that is doing this action, operating. The second one, as Vietnam has entered the WTO. Here, the problem was we introduce this clause with the word as. As is introducing a dependent clause, and we need an independent clause to complete this thought. However, nothing followed, so it sounded unusual. We could look and we could see Vietnam is the subject, has entered is our verb, but there was no complete thought because as introduced an idea which was never completed. We needed that second part to be brought together. Next, we're going to look at run-on sentences. This is essentially when there's missing punctuation. There's too much information that doesn't have something like a comma to properly structure it. So it's when we have multiple clauses and we're lacking the requisite punctuation. Now, the reason why people write like this is that actually it's quite normal in speaking. When people speak excitedly, we often bring together ideas, and we don't typically think in terms of punctuation. However, when we're writing, we need to think about punctuation. It breaks up our sentences, it structures our ideas, and it helps us to impart proper meaning. Let's look at some more mistakes and think how we can correct them. So I'd like you to look at these 2 errors, take another couple of minutes, think how you could change these to make them correct, and I'll show you the correct answer in just a moment. So here for our first example, there are 2 ways of changing this to make this correct. As you know, in English, there are often multiple ways to say something, so there's not just one correct answer. Our problem was that we had 2 independent clauses split by just a comma, and this is insufficient. Let's look at our answers now. The first sentence was wrong because it contained no punctuation. So we could fix it in one of 2 possible ways. We could either add a full stop, breaking the 2 parts of the sentence into 2 independent clauses, 2 simple sentences. Or we could turn one of those clauses into a relative clause by using the word whose and breaking the 2 clauses apart with a comma. The second mistake was that we split 2 independent clauses with a single comma. This was not grammatically correct, and so we needed to fix it. We could have done that in a few ways, but I think the clear best example is to insert the word because to show the relationship between the 2 clauses here. This turns the sentence into a complex one. Dangling participles are particularly difficult grammatical mistakes to fix because they're quite hard to see in your own work. What we mean by a dangling participle is essentially where we take 2 parts of a sentence and we mismatch them. In this kind of mistake, often we'll have part of the sentence intending to modify the object, but instead we will modify the subject by mistake. This can lead to some confusion. Let's look at some examples. In these 2 mistakes, we can find there's an issue with subject. If we look at the first one, having conducted a comprehensive investigation, we ought to include a subject before the second clause. In the second sentence, it sounds like the old church was turning, but of course a building cannot do that. Please pause the video and take a couple of minutes to try and correct these sentences. Here are your possible correct answers. In the first example, we can see we've simply inserted the word we to make clear who is the subject of this sentence. In the second, there are 2 possible answers. We can make clear one way or another that it was we who turned the corner rather than the church itself. Next, we have another very common IELTS mistake. This is something I see in almost every IELTS essay that I have ever marked. This is something called the Subject-Verb Disagreement. And basically, it's when you take the subject and verb and you don't get the correct form. So taking a plural form of a subject and a singular form of a verb and vice versa. Let's look at 3 examples of this kind of mistake, as they are so common. It would be useful to address them. So if we look at the first mistake, you can see we have the plural credits with then the plural confuses. Clearly this is incorrect. In the second, we are taking the word the president and we join that up with the plural are. Even though we include his wife and children, this verb matches with the subject president. Confusingly, the third example, we can see here salt, an uncountable noun, matches up with is used. What's the problem here? Well, actually, we're not referring to salt. We're referring to the traditional methods. We can see the correct answers here. So when you do your IELTS writing exam, you're going to be marked on your coherence and cohesion. So within this, we mean having all ideas in a sentence or all ideas in a paragraph relating very closely to one another. So a sentence must have a sense of unity, otherwise it's very confusing for the reader. So in a sentence, you must have these three things. The ideas must be closely related. The relationship of its statements must be clear. And the statements must compose only one thought. Coherence means that going from one sentence to the next, we must follow a logical order. And one way of doing this is to use connectors or linking words. So the reader must be able to follow your ideas quite clearly through your essay. Let's look at these three mistakes. These all are slightly different kinds of errors, but they all relate to unity and coherence. So in the first mistake, if we look, the committee first received many proposals and then an investigation began. You can see we're changing forms here. We're changing from active to passive voice within one sentence. In the second example, we're looking at faulty parallelism, meaning we're changing verb form throughout these three verbs. And in the third example, you can see there is an unclear meaning for this word it. We need to make this clearer in order to make the reader understand what we're trying to say. Pause the video now and take a minute or two to correct these mistakes. Here are three of the possible examples. You can see in the first one, we've made it clear the committee began the investigation, so we stay with the same voice. In the second one, we've kept all the verbs in the same tense. And in the third one, we've made clear that it refers to a letter. It's also important that we maintain some consistency through our writing. Try to maintain the correct tense as well as pronouns and choosing singulars or plurals. One mistake that I often see is students changing from they to us to you. So an example here would be saying they want to achieve self-fulfillment in their career. However, if you don't work hard, you won't succeed. We ought to change all of these to either they or you. We can't flip back and forth between them. Okay guys, I hope you found this lesson useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Click the notifications button. You can also head on over to our website, www.TED-IELTS.com. We've got lots of free materials for you to improve your IELTS abilities. And any IELTS teachers out there might want to take a look at www.IELTSteaching.com. That's a new website I started recently. As always, let me know what you think in the comments below. If you have any requests, any questions, anything you want to say at all, just leave a comment. I'll try to reply. And I'll see you again next week.